Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Hello and welcome to another Power Trends podcast. I am Kevin Lanahan, Vice President, External Affairs and Corporate Communications at the New York Independent System Operator. Today, we're joined by Aaron Markham, Vice President of Operations. We've been meaning to have Aaron in for quite some time. We're going to learn about what his role is and what operations here at the NYISO does. We're also going to talk about this concept and phenomenon called the peak day. For those folks who aren't familiar, this is the day of the year when there's the most usage, demand, consumption on the system. And a lot goes into keeping the system reliable under those conditions. And we're going to walk through that with Aaron. We had a peak day this year on September 6th. But Aaron, welcome to the Power Trends podcast. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Kevin. Happy to be here and looking forward to discussing the peak day.
Yeah. So you've been here since 1999, almost from the inception of the markets. Tell us what your first job here was.
Yes. So I started in 1999 as a control room operator at the NYISO. So I spent about 10 years on shift on the rotating 24/7, 365 shift.
These are the folks who are in the control room, seeing system conditions in real time and making decisions about how to maintain reliability.
That is correct. So currently we have 7 positions that are on shift 24/7, 365, maintaining reliability of the power system. When I started, there were a few less people on shift, but as the complexity of the system has grown, we've added more individuals to make sure we can reliably operate the power system. So I spent about 10 years on shift, worked in all the various positions that existed at the time. And then in 2009, I came off shift for a management role. So I spent the remaining time off shift, managing the various groups. And then about 18 months ago, I got promoted to Vice President of Operations.
Yeah, congratulations, by the way. So let's go back. I think it'd be helpful to listeners to understand. You mentioned you did a rotation, in effect. You were on the control room floor. You were in each of the different positions. And so you got a lot of exposure to how everything works and the different responsibilities on the floor. Tell us, what were some of those roles there? If you happen upon the control room floor, what are those folks doing in real time?
Yes, so the folks monitor many parameters that exist on the system and make sure they maintain those parameters within limits. So some of the positions are what we call interchange scheduler. So that is the position that works with the neighboring areas. So we're connected to New England to the east, Hydro-Quebec to the north, the Ontario system operator to the west, and the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, PJM interconnection to the south.
These are what we call the tie lines, among other things, helps keep the system reliable.
Correct. And over those tie lines or over those interconnections with those regions, we can schedule economic interchange to help meet the load and demand in the various regions. So the interchange scheduling position essentially coordinates that flow of energy amongst the neighboring regions. So that's one of the positions that I actually operated through my time on shift. Another position on shift is a generator operator position. So in New York, we have a number of generators or supply resources that contribute to supply to meeting demand. We send control signals to those every 5 minutes or more frequently to maintain the balance of supply and demand on the system. The generator operator position is monitoring the resources' response to those signals and accommodating or taking actions if for some reason those resources can't meet the schedule that we send them. So that may be for mechanical issues or other issues at the plants. Another position was the system operator. So the system operator really monitors the transmission system. So flows on the transmission system, voltages, and make sure that all those flows and voltages are within limits to make sure that the system operates reliably. There are events on the system, we call them contingencies, where there's a sudden event, maybe a loss of a transmission line or a transmission line trip because it faults and opens. Think of it as a circuit breaker in your house opening. When that happens, the flow that was on that line redistributes to the other lines, and then the operators potentially have to take corrective actions depending on how that flow redistributes and if that causes another parallel facility or facility that picks up that flow to go over limits, then there's certain timing requirements that the operators have to get that flow back within limits within. So that's the main responsibility of the system operator. And then the last position I'll touch upon, it's not all the positions in the control room, but is the shift manager. So that position really monitors the overall health of the power system and can take action and direct the operators to take additional corrective actions as needed.
And to become a shift manager, you're going to have experience throughout all these different roles.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And the shift manager on the control room floor and managing all the different factors that go into reliability and economic dispatch, it's like a symphony.
Yes, people have likened it to air traffic controller of electrons, conducting a symphony, a couple other analogies, but really trying to choreograph all the various components of the power system and make sure everything is within balance and within limits. So it's a really interesting position. If you like electricity and like to look at a lot of screens and data, it's a very interesting position. Every day is a bit different.
So on that theme, so making sure that you're ready and aware of the things that can present themselves to you that you maybe aren't expecting, but being ready for that and then making decisions, not just how to correct the situation that just presented itself to you, but what happens possibly with the next step and the next step beyond that.
Correct. So it's not only looking at what's the worst thing that could happen right now, but once that worst thing happens, what's the next worst thing and what actions and tools are at your disposal as an operator or at the operator's disposal to be able to basically respond to that and going a couple of steps deep. So think of it as playing chess, right? You've got your next move.
Right.
What does the board look like after that next move or after that contingency? And then what is the next thing you want to do and how does that all fit together? In a number of days, you don't have to go to those next moves, but you always have to be ready in case they show up to maintain reliable operation.
Fair to say most of the year, the system's performing and behaving in a sense in the way that you forecast it the day prior. You're looking at the weather, you're looking at the system conditions, you're looking at the number of generators that are available to you. But there are days, and this is where we want to focus, like the peak day on September 6th that present curveballs, and you need to be ready for those.
Correct. And one of the positions that I didn't mention, but I will now, is the RTC operator. So they're the ones that's really tasked at looking at the load forecast and the capacity or the overall resources on the system. And do we have enough to meet the load forecast, to meet those unexpected events and still maintain some level of headroom on the generation? We call that reserve, but it's essentially unused capability that can be called on fairly quickly to provide additional energy and make up for those contingencies and redistribute and rebalance the flow.
So on September 6th, what was the peak megawatts?
So the peak load on the 6th was just over 30,200 megawatts.
And our historic peak load?
Our historic peak load was just under 34,000.
So about 3,000 megawatts below what the historic peak was, maybe a little more than that, but yeah.
Yes, but over that time, there's been a number of changes on the system. So there's been generator retirements. There's been the addition of a lot of what we call behind the meter solar. So the solar on people's rooftops that you may see driving around, which from our perspective actually reduces the demand that we need to serve because that supply or that solar generation is offsetting what we look at as load. So on the peak day this year, our estimates are the rooftop solar, the behind the meter solar actually reduced our peak by about 1,000 megawatts.
Right. Okay. So what's happening in the few days before September 6th? We're starting to experience hot weather. There's more hot weather and humidity forecast, not just in one part of the state, which sometimes happens, but the entire region. So we're expecting demand to go up, but what's happening in the 24 to 48 hours prior to September 6th? If you could describe what you're thinking about, what the control room operators are trying to anticipate.
So every day we get an updated load forecast that looks about 5 days in the future. So we really start planning for the operating day about 5 days out in the real-time environment. So as this heat wave is coming in, we can see that the temperatures and the humidity are building. that the load forecast is indicating an increase in demand for that day. So we start taking actions many days in advance, things such as ensuring that the transmission system is intact. So if transmission facilities are out for maintenance, we start asking the utilities to bring those back in service. If generators are out on maintenance, we ask them to start making themselves available. Some of the generators in New York need a couple of days to start because they're big machines and it takes a long time to get them up and running. So we start asking them to make themselves available, all in preparation for what could be a peak load day or a peak load demand. We also start coordinating with the neighbors because, as we talked about earlier, the ability to buy and sell energy with the neighbors is really helpful and beneficial from a reliability perspective. So we start reaching out and coordinating with them to see what they're forecasting. Are they going to have surplus? Is there going to be a need in their area? And essentially developing plans to meet that peak load.
And again, the neighbors in this case are Canada, New England, and then the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland control
Correct.
area. Yep. So looking at what's available in these different areas in these situations, maybe getting ready for how we might be helping them.
The help and supply goes both directions, right? We can help them out in times of need and they help us out in times of need as well.
Right. So let's pause here and I got a question for you. Have we seen a peak day in September before?
We have. It's been a couple of years and it is really unique. It takes the right kind of...
It's usually in the summer.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Typically the peak summer day would be in the July or August timeframe, just based on the fact that currently a lot of the demand for electricity is driven by air conditioning in New York. So the hotter, more humid conditions that exist in July and August are typically what drive our peak.
So what are you seeing on the system and what do you have available for you to meet this peak on the 6th in the days prior?
Yeah. So as we...
There were some unique occurrences and some, like we said before, call them curveballs, but things that were unexpected that you had to account for and shift.
Correct. So as we approached the 6th going into that weekend, we had some generation that became forced out of service, unexpectedly unavailable. So that was one of the curveballs that the operators had to deal with. And the way we deal with that in the short term is we bring on additional generation. So we have a process where typically the day ahead market runs and it commits the supply resources for the next day. And if something unexpected happens, that's where the operators jump in or start to take action. So as we moved into that peak period, the day ahead market was expecting that generation to be available because it was at the time the day ahead ran. But when it became forced out of service, the operators had to evaluate system conditions and take additional actions. The subsequent day ahead runs, as we got closer to the peak, actually factored in that generation wasn't going to be available through our market rules. So it committed additional supply resources. So each day after the day ahead market runs, the operators evaluate the supply resources that are available and can take additional actions as needed. So
sort of looking at the lineup and saying, okay, this is what we have available to us, but we've got to think of contingencies here. So what else might we have to schedule?
So what could go wrong? What else do we need to schedule to make sure we can maintain the reliability of the power system? So each day as we approached the peak, the operators were doing that, and that resulted in us committing some additional generation to make sure we had sufficient supply. As we continued to get closer to the peak, more units became unavailable unexpectedly, which meant even though the day before it looked like we were going to have a lot of surplus, the contingency we were planning for actually occurred and the surplus became less on the system. So every time that happens, that kicks off a new evaluation and a look at what resources can we commit, with the fact being that a lot of units take time to get on. So as you get closer to the peak or closer to that condition, the pool of resources that's available actually shrinks.
Can we talk about some of the reasons why some of these units weren't available?
Yeah, so generating plants are huge, complex machines with lots of components. So things like pumps or faults on the electrical equipment at the plant or other things can happen. I mean, think of your car, right? If the alternator doesn't work, the car doesn't run. Very
Hmm.
similar to a power plant. If one of the pumps fails, the power plant ceases to operate until that can be repaired. So,
Mechanicals.
mechanical things,
Yeah.
electrical things. At times we actually see fuel being a concern. In this peak period, fuel wasn't a concern, but if you don't have gas in the tank, your car doesn't run. Same thing with a power plant.
So the other thing that you and the control room operators are very aware of then is the age of these plants.
That is correct. Yes. The plants in New York, I think, are some of the oldest in the nation. There's a lot of maintenance and upkeep and money spent to keep them running and functioning. But with age, things break and you can't replace everything all at once. So as the plants age, their potential to have forced outages increases, even with all the maintenance that is done to prepare them for operation.
And this is what presents itself to you and the operators on September 6th to some degree.
To some degree, yes.
Okay. So then what else were maybe some anomalies or interesting curveballs that you were experiencing on the day?
So as we get into the day and we continue to do the coordination with the neighboring regions, it becomes aware that not only in New York, but in the neighboring regions, there's issues with generator performance, load forecast, or load is actually coming in higher than forecast. So what on a day ahead basis looked like there was a reasonable amount of surplus in the region quickly started to diminish. So in those coordination calls, which are very useful on those days, the regions talk through what are they forecasting? How much surplus are they having? Are they going to need additional assistance? We do have actions, which we call emergency procedures, procedures that we don't implement often, but we can implement to help maintain reliable service. So we talk through what amount of capability is available if we implement those procedures. Is there an expectation that we need to implement those procedures, et cetera?
I just want to highlight something that you're touching on here, but there's a lot of very close coordination in the days before you're dealing with these events with the neighbors, but also the utilities in the state. Very close coordination, communication the day of, like, what are you seeing on your system? And if we have to make a change or a decision, you're talking that through before you actually have to do it.
Yeah, the expectation is that we've talked through all the potential contingencies that could occur. What is the system going to look like? What is the set of resources that we're going to use to resolve that? And make sure that everybody is on board, from the neighbors to the utilities in the state to the NYISO operators in the room.
So there's been a lot of attention to the peaker plants in New York City. We just retired, pursuant to DEC regulations, more than 1,000 megawatts of peaking capability in the city. It's a good news story in the sense that they are old, they are inefficient, they're the dirtiest of plants. So it's in line with the state's decarbonization policies. But that also presents some curveballs in these situations. And we run those plants only when the system is almost as a last resort and to meet system conditions that are extreme or stressful. Did we run peaker plants on that day? Were they in service?
We definitely ran some peaker plants on that day. One of the unique attributes of those peaker plants is their ability to start quickly. So as you said, Kevin, typically they are there and available to start, but we typically don't call on them unless some unique condition comes up, a contingency happens, or the demand gets very high. So they do provide a lot of flexibility on the system. And obviously, with a reduction of that capability, that puts some additional pressure on the other plants to perform and make sure that we maintain reliable operation.
So you had mentioned earlier that solar is really instrumental in helping to shave these peaks, but that's always contingent on whether Mother Nature is cooperating at that particular time. Tell us about the contribution of renewables throughout the day and then in those peak hours, which happen in the afternoon.
Yes, so it happened to be a very sunny day on the 6th, or relatively sunny. So we definitely got a lot of contribution of behind the meter solar to help reduce the peak load. But as everybody knows, it does get dark in the evening. So while that solar production peaks around noon, 1 o'clock, it starts to reduce as the sun starts to set, which actually causes the peak load to shift further out into the evening. So on the 6th, the peak load was in the 5 o'clock hour, which was, after the heat of the day, but at the point where the solar started to reduce. And that's when the demand that the other plants in the system needed to serve actually peaked.
It's important to keep in mind when you have a number of hot days strung together, especially in the city, the concrete's still holding the heat even though the sun goes down. People are still turning those air conditioners up, and that adds to the demand, as you said, being pushed out a little farther into the afternoon hours.
That is correct, especially as people return home from work and want their house cool, they turn on the air conditioner. So that's a demand that lingers later into the evening.
So what you just described with the contribution of solar and then what the system demands were in those approaching evening hours, this is what we've seen in California the last couple of years with their challenges meeting demand in the evening with a different array of tools and units to choose from. Sort of a case study in what California has been dealing with on a grander scale.
Yes, exactly. So, with the amount of solar that has been installed in California, they were the kind of the leading indicator that this phenomenon was going to exist in New York. And, our future planning studies, so we do forecast the load and different aspects out a number of years. So while our planning studies and our forecasts were showing this, when it actually occurred in California, that was good validation that what we are seeing in our forecasting models was a phenomenon that was going to exist in New York in the future. So we are actually starting to realize that in real time.
And interesting that in California, it's also been in September or after those summer months, probably mostly because there's not as much sunlight available as you're getting through the month of August and the sun's going below the horizon earlier in the day.
Yeah. That is correct. As we go into fall, the number of daylight hours reduces in the Northern Hemisphere and in New York, and therefore there's less total production of that solar energy as the daylight hours shrink.
Yeah, the story of solar the last few months has really been interesting with the smoke too, coming down from out of Canada. We've produced some blogs and tried to talk about and educate the impact that that's had on the ability for us to use that solar in real time. And then it's always interesting that the last few years have been breaking solar peaks very early in the spring or, in the spring. Part of that reason is the leaves are off of the trees. So these are things that may not be, obvious to folks, but factor into the ability to use those renewables.
Yes, exactly. And another renewable that we have on the system in fairly large quantity is wind power. So we've got a lot of land-based wind, about 2,500 megawatts of nameplate installed capacity. But very similar to the solar, if the fuel is not in the atmosphere, i.e. the wind isn't blowing, those resources are dependent on that fuel. So if it's a calm day, which it was a relatively calm day on the 6th, there was fairly low production of those wind resources to help meet the peak.
Any numbers jump out at you right now that you can share with us?
Yeah, roughly about 200 megawatts of production came from the land-based wind in New York during the peak hour.
Okay. Out of
the 2,500 megawatt nameplate.
Okay. And out of a total demand of 30,000.
200 megawatts.
Yeah. So I know that when the operators go through these events, there's a lot of analysis, lessons learned. What were some of the takeaways and things that stood out that you brought with you through that event?
Yeah, really the takeaway is that as we add more intermittent production to the system, the forecasts of that become really key in our planning activities, right? So we forecast what the demand is going to be. We have a vendor that forecasts what the solar production is going to be. We have a vendor that forecasts what the wind production is going to be. Each one of those can have errors in it. And to the extent that they compound, that can create a larger than forecast deviation that we have to accommodate for. The other variable, which we talked about, is actually the performance of the other resources on the system. So, as we gain additional experience with their performance, we can then factor that in and accommodate that in our planning to make sure that we have sufficient resources available.
Fair to say that the forecasting function has become more challenging and A lot of that has to do with different weather patterns and experiences.
Yes, that is fair to say. The forecasts rely a lot or very heavily on history to project what is going to happen.
Loads of data over many years and decades that goes into the software and helps us with determining what we should expect. And all of a sudden, we've got anomalous weather, and it's more
Correct.
challenges.
So the forecasting algorithms don't have that history and that sample of data to look back on to be reasonably confident of what's going to occur. So, as we get into these more extreme periods, we have a load forecasting group that does a lot of analysis on what the forecast is saying and provides some human input into, is it actually accounting for all the different variables that are going to occur, the extreme temperature, the extreme humidity, et cetera.
All right, Aaron, this has been really interesting. We're talking about the summer peak day and what went into meeting the demands on the system. Let's shift to last winter, different season, different conditions, different challenges, and talk about, we wrote a blog on this, on the event of Christmas Eve and the weather that we saw from roughly December 23rd to 27th. There were a lot of challenges on the system, a lot of really sudden, extreme cold weather. Walk us through that particular day. You and I actually were on the phone a couple of times because there was some concern and there were real challenges being presented to you and the operators in the control room.
Yeah, Kevin. So that event started very similar to what we described going into this last event. So we started to see forecasts of the extreme weather, the very warm weather, and then the very sharp turn to cold or Arctic air that was forecasted not only in New York, but across the region. So we'd started making preparations, as we talked about, evaluating the forecast, having discussions with the neighboring areas to see what their conditions were, making sure that we had sufficient resources to meet the demand. One of the challenges, which I alluded to earlier, that really is prevalent in the winter is a great majority of the fleet in New York either burns natural gas or has the ability to burn multiple fuels. And typically the generators pick the most economic fuel to burn, which a majority of the year is natural gas. One unique challenging aspect of winter is in the winter, a lot of that gas actually goes to residential firm customers. So for heating homes, which the end result is that there's less gas available for generators to burn.
And the idea there is that people need to heat their homes because it's a health and safety issue.
That is correct. So that's why the priority is essentially to the firm gas customers to heat homes. So that was another factor that we were looking at. We have a survey process where we actually reach out to the generators to look at, what is their fuel supply situation? Do they have alternate oil backup in the tanks? Are they expecting deliveries of that? So that's another aspect that comes into winter operations, all of which we did leading up to this event. And, as we walked into the event, we had reasonable expectations that we were going to meet all the challenges that were going to present themselves during the event. As I talked about for the September event, things in the winter event evolved very quickly, and some of that's been out very publicly in the press. So as the cold front and the cold air moved across the Northeast, there were supply issues on the natural gas system that weren't forecasted. There were a number of generators, especially.
By the way, I just want to highlight, this is regional. This is beyond the borders of New York, where these sudden conditions exist, both in the weather and then in the gas system. There were wellheads that were freezing south of us that you rarely see.
That is correct. And as the cold actually moved into the southern regions of the U.S., there were forced generator outages. There was very high demand because of the cold weather, which caused challenges there. So from a New York perspective, as we talked earlier, we do our best to assist the neighbors through the interconnections. So while we were dealing with some forced generator outages in New York and a lot of units operating on their liquid fuel, we actually ended up supplying a large volume of energy to the interconnection to help support the neighbors to the south, which from a day ahead perspective, we were actually expecting to import some from those regions. So that was a very significant shift in the resources that we were forecasting to have available to us, but we were able to help support those neighbors in need. through the availability of the capacity in New York, as well as the surrounding areas in the Northeast. So that really goes to highlight the value of those interconnections in supporting not only the reliability of New York, but the reliability of the whole system.
Okay, yeah. So huge temperature swing, deep freeze, sudden, this is more extreme weather. As you look back and lessons learned from that event, how'd the system perform?
In New York, the system was reliable. We were able to maintain flows within limits, all the various parameters on the power system within limits. And we still did have, through the event, some surplus capability. We were actually limited on the amount we could support the neighbors to the south by the capability of the transmission system. But, definitely from a lessons learned perspective, again, the scrutiny on what the demand is going to be, scrutiny on the capability of the fuel supply system, the natural gas system in events leading up to, or the days leading up to these cold weather events, as well as the additional information we get and analysis we get of the liquid fuel that's stored at plants. And do we have enough stored energy essentially to meet the demand is key to continue to monitor and evaluate as we get more extreme winter weather.
So it highlights that the diverse resource mix we have in New York is so important. And the ability for those resources to shift to different fuels really is a huge reliability benefit as well. Gets us through some of these surprise weather events.
Yeah, the diversity of the resources, the diversity of the fuels they can burn is definitely very valuable from a reliability perspective in New York.
Aaron, this has been at once really informative and also fascinating to get a look inside the control room at how decisions are made and what the thinking is inside of the control room as you guys are facing these conditions has been incredibly helpful. I appreciate your joining us here today.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. It's been great to discuss this and happy to come back in the future if other topics arise.
We'll do another case study when the next extreme weather event happens because it seems more and more certain. Thanks again.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.